Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Debra Dank is a Gundungji, Wakaja and Kalkadoon woman from the Barkly Tablelands in the Northern Territory. Debra has spent 40 years working in primary, secondary and tertiary education roles in urban and remote areas across Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and the Northern Territory. Debra is interested in multiform narrative and its practice in Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. Her recent book, We Come With This Place, published in 2022, won 4 New South Wales Premiers Awards and the Australian Literature Society Gold Medal. Today I'm joined by Debra Dank to talk about her latest book, Ankami, To Give Life To. Debra, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Let's start with the title of this book, Ankami. What's the origin of that word, and what does that title tell us about the contents of this book?
This book was originally, the working title was Cavernous, and it was the thing that I'd responded to and felt first in the immediacy of finding out what had happened with my dad's siblings. And as I was getting to the end of the writing, I thought that it was, it needed something else. And I found this Gundungji word. Unfortunately, I sort of came back across this word, and it means to give life to, and I realized that that's what this book was about. For me, it was giving life to 4 people I don't know anything about other than they were my grandmother's children and they were taken. They were no longer with family. So, and then I sort of realized that if we change accent a little bit, the other potential titles could be, according to accent, Ankami, because in the book, with the development of the book, with the need to write the book, I was very angry. So it was anger me, and it worked very well. And then Ankami, which was also something that the process of writing this book allowed me to find and to go back to a place that was a lot more stable, that was a lot more comfortable about managing what to do with this new knowledge that I'd found. So, yeah, depending on accent, Greg, Ankami, Ankami.
In your introduction to Ankami, you write, I received a bundle of much-wished information from the National Archives. What was in that bundle? What was it you'd wished for? Where did that bundle lead you?
I'd completed a research trip and was in Darwin, and I had half a day. And I thought, now's the time to go into the archives office, which was very conveniently located in the centre of Darwin, as it were. And I went in imagining that I was going to find some information about my mum's family. And I thought, well, why not extend it a little bit, have a little look around to see what's there recorded around my dad's family. I hadn't really expected to find much about my dad's family because of the historical goings on in the Northern Territory with Aboriginal people on pastoral properties, particularly in the 60s and before. I didn't find a lot of information while I was in there. It was information that I'd found previously, but there was nothing newer or nothing that was more new. And the archivists were really lovely, and they said, if you'd like to leave names, we will be happy to do more searching for you. And so I gave them a list of names, and they didn't find anything more terribly much about my mum's family, but there were letters concerning some of my dad's family. And then, of course, there was that letter outlining the fact that my grandmother had passed away the child that she had birthed 3 days before her passing had also passed away. And there were 4 others. So there was a little bit of a recounting of the children that she had. And the letter writer said that there were 5 on the property. The 6th was the child that had passed away, and the other 4 he didn't know what had happened to. So it was really it was an incredibly surreal experience to read about these very close family members who were gone. And the fact that the man who had written the letter was someone who'd caused so much trauma to my family, to my grandmother, was something else again. Yeah, I said to someone the other day, I find myself in a, I don't know, I'm still thinking about what the proper word might be, but in this place where I have no respect for him as a human being, for what he did. Absolute disgust for what he did. But then I've kind of come to terms with being almost grateful to him for actually writing this obscenity, because I would not have known that there were 4 members of my family who were missing.
Is this a man whose name you cannot speak?
I will not, just out of respect for the fact of his family. I know that he has at least a son. I expect he has other children, but he'd also have grandchildren now as well. So I'm not going to, I have no interest in adding trauma.
To add flesh to some of the bones I had is one of the objectives of Ankami. But what sort of problems does that present for someone in search of family history and connection? And what role does cultural practice play in that search?
Yes, that's a really good question. There were always these little whisperings from different people, and I had been told by a couple of older women that my dad had more family. And I would ask my dad, and my dad would say no. And that would be it. There'd be nothing else, no further explanation. No. And it just all made sense when I found out. Dad's no actually gave me a lot of information when I found out about the other 4, because for my mom, we've always respected the fact that the human body is in this place for a tiny moment of time. And upon death, as it were, people journey to other places. When I read about the other 4, the no kind of populated all of the cultural knowledge that I'd had, but that I'd kind of put aside in trying to find out who knew about these 4 people. So the cultural knowledge contributed to no one speaking of them, and therefore my lack of knowledge of them. But it also gave me information about where knowledge sits, and I'm going over and I'm exploring some more of what that means, because it is, and it was, a cultural practice. It continues to be a cultural practice to not articulate the name of those who have passed away. And I had been told as a child that there were lots of times that when children were removed from families, that for all intents and purposes within that community, that they may have been considered to have passed away, because nobody knew where they were, where they'd gone, if they were ever going to be able to return. So yeah, it's really messy, but the dots kind of connected in a strange way.
That leads me to another idea that's explored at length in this book, which is memory. Removal of children from their families also meant the interruption of memory, including connection to family and to country. What did that mean for you in the pursuit of your objective in building a clearer picture of your family?
It was really difficult because my dad had passed away, and my mum and my dad both were always telling me, just write, Deborah, write down our stories, record our stuff. So the idea and the place of memory and the role it played was really, again, something that was quite fluid in how it manifested itself within the narrative process. In my first book, for example, my then 5-year-old son said, and people are amazed that it's an absolute and utter truth. He said to me, we'd had a mother and child argument about me wanting him to keep his shoes on his feet, and he insisted, my feet have grown here, Mum. My feet know this place. This is their country. My feet aren't going to be bothered by the Bindies because my feet are mine right at this moment. I'm borrowing them. And they will continue to walk here after I'm gone. So that kind of explanation from a child is a beautiful explanation of cellular memory. And the idea of the body remembering is not something that's new or crazy or challenging. For Gudanji people, I expect it's the same, not new, not challenging kind of thing for other Aboriginal populations. And cellular memory for Gudanji people is not new science. Cellular memory for Gudanji people is a fact. It's a practice. It's something that we know to happen and exist. Our articulation, of course, is different from a Western science explanation, but we're always aware that the physical body is quite a momentary thing. When it comes to the Western idea of memory, people always ask me about, well, is that true? Did that really happen? Is that how it occurred? So there's a sense of memory having a contained and quite specific space. It occupies a specific place. So that kind of memory, it does require a different kind of thing to add the flesh to the bones, because when I reflected on my dad's no and no and no, then it was the Gudanji memory then that allowed me to actually hear, and I don't mean that in any kind of ephemeral kind of sense, but in a sense around understanding these the Gudanji cultural presence of people and country. It kind of allowed me to recognize that we'd been recognizing their presence without articulating it. That no signaled that we knew about them, but we didn't have the memory, the Western idea of memory, to shape any more than that.
Is this concept a difficult thing to communicate to non-Indigenous people?
As a semiotician, my thing is about stretching the vocabulary of Standard Australian English to ensure that the cultural concepts embedded within Western cultures or English-speaking cultures and Aboriginal cultures have the vocabulary to name them. And when we try to explain things that exist within Aboriginal cultures, it's really, really difficult because we literally don't have the words. My second book, I created the word pteroglossia because there wasn't a word in English that articulated this absolute Aboriginal understanding of earth and country being an entity that shared narrative, that composed narrative, that participated in narrative. So I created Terra Glossia. And we need to do that more and more, I think, because I come across, that word tribe is always quite problematic when speaking with Aboriginal folk. But tribe is a word that's historically it's been associated with First Nations peoples wherever. But now we have our soccer tribe, we have our coffee tribe, we have our whatever kind of tribe. We are all talking a lot more about culture. We are talking about kin. We are talking about connection. And we must all speak about those things. But the problem with all of us using that vocabulary is that for minority groups, the dominant culture controls what that definition encompasses. So my connection to country, which has grown across literally 60,000 years at least of obligation and responsibility, is now minimalized when I hear people wanting to climb sacred places because they have a sacred connection to that place. And, and they've been climbing there for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or, 6 years. So that's the problem when we have an uncritiqued vocabulary set that two different cultures share.
Before we leave the idea of memory, I want to talk about something you introduced in your book, the idea of imagined memories. You write, imagined memories bloom like wildflowers in the cracks of a past now shattered. What do you mean by imagined memories, and what purpose do they serve?
It's no surprise to anybody in Australia when I say family has always been more than significant for Aboriginal communities. And it's not just about presence or the presence of people. It's about what we bring to the space of family, how we contribute to the space of family, and what that looks like. And so some of the imagined memories would be and are about what, if any of those four were women, what they would then share with me, what they would teach me. And so I have other people in that generation who have taught me different things. I have some aunties who taught me how to make coolamans. I have other aunties and grannies who taught me how to make baskets. I have others who taught me how to strip the pandanus to make the baskets. And so those sorts of memories that are based on fact and reality and practice and cultural responsibility, I move to, if one of those or two or three or four of those four were female, then it would be their responsibility to teach me those kinds of things. So imagined memory is then me imagining what I have been told and how I have been taught by these four who are not with us.
You've talked about culture, and in a way, you've also talked about information, and it's this idea of information versus culture and the difference between the two. I think you're right. Culture is absorbed, lived every day. If that's the case, then what's information?
Information, I think, is something that can contribute absolutely to culture if we're talking about a capital C culture rather than a cultural identity, if you like, if we're talking more of a global culture. If we go on the internet, anybody can read about basket making, Aboriginal basket making practices. But the intrinsic knowledge around that as a process, for me, is encompassed within the place of culture when the basket making. And I reckon I really am and truly am a stoic. If you are a basket maker, it's around the purpose. It's around all of the intent behind the basket making. And I think this also brings into question the role of aesthetic within moments of living, because if we are producing things for aesthetic value and purpose rather than the more mundane, if you like, daily use, then we have two different products. My basket making is around the mundane. It's around making baskets for a purpose. It's not about the aesthetics of having a really lovely product sitting somewhere as an artwork. And this is also part of my little gripe about Aboriginal iconography being moved and claimed and identified now to be art. Aboriginal iconography is the same as those alphabets from all around the world that were purposeful, that were filled with intent to share knowledge. Aboriginal folk can read those traditional mark-making practices and products, and they are books in the same way that we know to be Western books. So again, it goes back to how the English language collapses a lot of Aboriginal knowledges, a lot of Aboriginal systems, a lot of Aboriginal practices into something that is quite binaric. And our languages were not ever binaric. Our languages were always filled with possibility and across this matrices system of meaning making.
Let's go off in a slightly different direction if it's okay. I'd like to talk about your father. Your father was a station worker for many years. He spoke 3 languages, but was considered to be illiterate, a judgment made by people who are usually monolingual. Tell me a little bit about your father.
My dad was probably going to make me cry. My dad was one of the most amazing, capable, naturally intelligent men that I've ever met. He was super smart, He and I we restored at least 2. He did 3 Bedfords right from scratch, restored them totally. This is someone who didn't ever go to school. No, I'm lying. He went to school for a week in grade 1 and decided it wasn't for him. But he restored these Bedfords amazingly, brilliantly. He always had a car. They were always kept on the road. He was a brilliant windmill mechanic, and the stations where he worked as a windmill mechanic never ever had any losses of stock through drought and lack of water. He taught me how to make horseshoes and how to shoe my horse. This is before I was 10, I could make my own horseshoes and shoe my horses and break my horses in. If something needed doing, he just did it. He spoke 3 of our languages, but not a lot of standard Australian English. And he was considered illiterate. He was identified in government documents as being illiterate because he didn't speak standard Australian English. So, he was an amazing horse breaker. He broke in the feature horse at the Mount Isa Rodeo when the Queen came to see it. And that was actually the first horse that I learned to ride on, the feature horse that was fierce and unrideable. He was never a drinker. He smoked like any kind of chimney. He was paid in tobacco as a child. So, of course, he had emphysema towards the end of his life. And he struggled with, there were moments of significant domestic violence in our home. And I don't ever condone domestic, violence of any way, shape, or form is not ever okay. And it's not ever acceptable and shouldn't ever be reasoned away. But, and there's always a but, I could always see that he was as horrified of the violence as my mother and I were. And one day he actually said, he broke down and he said, I don't understand why they did to us what they did. They treated the stock better than they treated us. So he was aware of how that kind of history had impacted him and was very aware that, he was not always in a good place. But, having said that, I truly couldn't and wouldn't change my childhood because there was such a richness, an absolute richness, and his background and his history and his actions absolutely reflected the complexity of his growing and the place and the time of his growing.
You mentioned that he was paid in tobacco, and you tell us a little bit about the Drover's Boys. I want to know what life as a drover's boy was like, with the idea that you were paid not with money, but in rations. That somehow equals slavery.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Drover's Boys were women. They were not boys. The Drover's Boys were women, and they were Aboriginal women who were often, I've lost the word, they were made to look like they were men, disguised. They were disguised as men. And yeah, I know several Aboriginal women now very, very elderly who were Drover's Boys, including my grandmother. And Ted Egan, who was a past administrator in the Northern Territory, but also an amazing musician and storyteller. He sings about the Drover's Boy. It's quite a contested and painful kind of imagining. Aboriginal people were paid in rations, and it wasn't until the unions in the South became involved, and when it was deemed that Aboriginal people were worthy of being paid the same way that non-Aboriginal folk were being paid, then a lot of Aboriginal people were forced off cattle properties that were home country, homelands. So the ration thing was done all across Australia. And yeah, absolutely, it was slavery. But in Australia, we don't like to talk about those sorts of things because we're the lucky country, aren't we? And we treat everybody properly like we want to be treated, and we give everybody a fair go. But that's only the case for a particular part of the community. And it's still absolutely the case with particular parts of the community. I was part of the Stolen Wages group here in Queensland, along with my parents and grandparents, great-grandparents, but my dad is part of the Stolen Wages group in the Northern Territory, as was his mum and generations before them. So yeah, it's a really interesting thing because it has to be sanitized for good Australians to be able to engage with, because it causes too much angst and it causes too much trauma. Well, imagine what it's like for the Aboriginal people. Again, we don't have the vocabulary to explain or express that kind of angst or trauma. So, yeah, we had slavery here, absolutely and utterly. Some cattle stations actually recorded families in all kinds of ways, but they were called stud books. How does that become a thing and not be part of the narrative around slavery? It's not a good and decent history, and it's not okay, but what do we do with that? If we acknowledge it, isn't that a good thing? Can we not just acknowledge it and kind of work out how we make better choices in the future, be better people?
Fruitcake,
It's the good stuff.
or at least a recipe for fruitcake, is one of the many threads winding its way through this book. But it's not just fruitcake we're talking here, it's an expression of something else.
Christmas tradition, my mum, my grandma, my great-grandma, all my maternal female forebears that I know of, Christmas had to be a thing. It was always a thing, and it was a traditional Western Christmas. So despite living out on the plains country where it was 47 degrees and living in a corrugated iron shack, we still fired up that stove. We still boiled the plum pudding. We still harvested our chickens. We killed the piglet that had grown across the year, and we made our ham and we dressed the pork. We did all of that. And Christmas cake was that special kind of treat. It was the sugar in an otherwise quite sour living, a living that was so ordinary and so thankless and so hard and so daunting in many respects, because it was constant and it was unrelenting. And I don't think that was only for Aboriginal people in those times. I think that was what life was in the 50s and the 60s, I'm talking about particularly. But the fruit cake it was kind of the adult equivalent of kids waking up on Christmas morning and finding presents under a tree. And my mum, when it came time to bake the fruitcake, would always be thinking how she could add a little bit more of the good stuff, of the richness of the Christmas season. We're all non-drinkers, you see, and one time my mum decided that, yep, it's time. We're going to go and we're going to buy a bottle of alcohol. Well, we didn't know what kind of alcohol. And then Mum was an amazing reader. Mum read everything that she could possibly get her hands on. And so she knew that it had to be brandy, at least. Brandy was a lot more acceptable, apparently, for my mum. Rum was something else again. It was a little bit harsher. It was kind of like, no, women don't do that. So we kind of ventured into adding brandy, and yeah, Christmas cake's always important. I haven't made a Christmas cake this year, and I didn't make one last year, and I've got such a huge dose of good Methodist guilt.
Deborah, my final question is not exactly a question, but it's this idea of genre. And for you, genre is meaningless. How do you explain that to people who want to read this book?
This is a really interesting question, and I struggle because with the first book, the publisher said to me, so where would you place this? What genre would you locate this? And it was kind of a bit shocking for a number of reasons. But I think it all goes towards my lack of knowing around what genre my work fits into, because I still don't see myself as writing books. I can cope with seeing myself as a storyteller, and so that's quite different to someone who writes books. I think because of my growing in the places that I grew with the people who grew me, writing books is something else again, but I can tell their stories. I can contribute to them becoming more fleshed. I can contribute in ways that their bones do not dust away. So I don't know what genre anything that I write fits into. And I'm really comfortable with that. And I kind of have a little bit of a moment that someone said, you're a bit mischievous, aren't you, Deborah? And I hope I am mischievous and not just plain mean, because every time someone sort of asks about genre, I kind of have a little bit of a laugh because I honestly don't know. And I really like that people struggle, because it's breaking again that framing that we have through a Western construct. Aboriginal writing shouldn't easily fit into a genre, other than if the Aboriginal writing category becomes a genre. And I don't know how that would work either, but
Well, Deborah, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
thank you so much, Greg. I've had a really lovely time chatting, and your questions were really good.
I've been talking to Debra Dank about her latest book, Ankami, To Give Life To. It's published by Echo, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.